But he came to the conclusion that there was no contradiction between his aspiration for socialism on the one hand and the demand for independence on the other. So they shared common ground, formed an alliance, and led the rising. Now, in military terms, the rising was a complete failure. It only lasted for 1 week. It was confined to Dublin, and afterwards the leaders were court-martialed and executed. But that was the big mistake the British made, because the executions created martyrs. That stirred up public opinion against the British, and that created the conditions for the later, more successful War of Independence, which broke out in January 1919. That was the guerrilla war led by Michael Collins, which I'll talk about a little later. So next we're going to take a look at Christchurch Cathedral. So go back out the door.
How many people were executed?
16. Not that many, but it was a propaganda. There is St. Patrick's, 5 minutes to the south of us. Christchurch was founded in 1030 by Christianized Vikings. It was a wooden building, none of which survives today, because it was rebuilt in stone in the 1170s. And the man responsible was Richard de Clare, better known by his nickname Strongbow. So who was Strongbow? And how did he get involved in Irish affairs? Now, back at City Hall, or back at rather Dublin Castle, I explained that Brian Boru defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf. But because he was killed, his dynasty ended, and consequently no single Irish king, undisputed king, emerged. You had a high kingship or an ordery in theory. In practice you had these rival provincial kings, local kings. Now by the middle of the following century, the 1100s, the most powerful of these kings was Rory O'Connor, King of Connaught, that's west of the River Shannon. And he styled himself... That's okay, 1 o'clock. He styled himself High King of Ireland, but in small print with opposition. And the opposition came from Diarmid MacMurrough, who was the King of Leinster, the southeastern province. Diarmid MacMurrough was forced to flee into exile. He was defeated by Rory O'Connor, so he made his way to England and to the court of the King of England, Henry II, and he appealed for military assistance. Now, Henry II gave Diarmid permission to recruit mercenaries amongst the feudal knights and barons of England. Why? Because Henry saw an opportunity to get rid of a few of these troublesome knights and barons. So he gave his blessing to this. So Diarmid recruited Strongbow as his main mercenary, and together they invaded the southeast of Ireland in 1169. Now this was private enterprise, remember. They captured Waterford City, and to celebrate the victory, Strongbow married Diarmid's daughter, Aoife, on the assumption that he was now Diarmid's designated successor. Shortly after that, Diarmid MacMurrough died of natural causes, and then Strongbow stepped in and claimed to be his successor, not only as King of Leinster, but he claimed to be High King of all Ireland. And what's more, he had the military hardware to do the job. Heavy armour, superior weapons. So within a year, Strongbow captured Dublin City. He defeated Rory O'Connor and looked as if he was now well on the way to carving out his own kingdom in Ireland. And as I said, this was private enterprise, so when Henry II found out what was going on, he became very concerned, because his plan was to get rid of Strongbow and people like him into obscurity, possibly even death. It wasn't to set him up as a successful king and therefore as a potential rival. So he decided to put a stop to this by invading Ireland himself, primarily to stop Strongbow. Now the only problem was Henry II needed a legal pretext to justify the invasion, because in those days you needed a legal pretext to invade another country. It's different today. But anyway, the legal pretext was provided by the Pope in Rome, Adrian IV, who issued a document giving the monarchs of England permission to invade Ireland. The argument was this was to civilise the natives, you know, introduced through religion, the usual sort of excuses. But I think the key fact here was that this was the one and only English Pope ever in history. His original name was Nicholas Breakspere, and that was just a lucky break for Henry II, his man was in the Vatican. You could say he had the equivalent of the Security Council in his pocket. So Henry II invaded Ireland with this document from the Pope giving him authority. Strongbow was forced to submit, as did many of the Gaelic Irish kings and chieftains, and that was the start of the original medieval English intervention. But as I explained at the start, it didn't lead to a complete conquest. They began to settle down, they began to intermarry, and the thing ran out of steam after about a century. Strongbow didn't become the King of Ireland, but he did rebuild Christ Church Cathedral in stone. This often happened a lot, you know, with these military guys who committed terrible atrocities and so on throughout their lives, and just as they're coming towards the end, just to be on the safe side, they would take their ill-gotten gains and endow a church or a cathedral or whatever. Happened all over Europe. Now, what you see today, most of it is not Strongbow's cathedral, except for the southern transept. See the bit sticking out here and the ruin here? This is the old chapter house, the administration block. That's original, and you see it has the original Romanesque style with rounded arches. The rest of the building is Gothic in style, pointed arches, not medieval, but 19th century Gothic revival, or neo-Gothic. The cathedral was almost totally rebuilt in the 1870s. They had to rebuild it, by the way, it was almost falling down. But that was a very expensive job, financed by a retired whiskey distiller called Henry Rowe. And the other cathedral, St. Patrick's, was rebuilt shortly before by Benjamin Guinness of the brewing family. So after the tour, you can all go straight to the pub with a clear conscience and have a pint of Guinness, a small whiskey, and commemorate their pious memories. So, but we're going to move on to our next stop, the Law Courts, and I want to talk about the War of Independence and the Civil War that followed. So next stop.